share some of your questions with the speakers. Our first speaker for this session is Professor Travis Waller. Travis is the head of the School of Civil Environmental Engineering in the Faculty of Engineering at the University of New South Wales. Travis' research looks into the mathematical representations of transport systems to support the planning and the management of mobility and infrastructure. And so we welcome Travis as he helps us to think about mobility infrastructure as a platform. Thank you, Travis.
No, thank you, Luke. I appreciate it. Hello, everyone. Today, I want to give a very high-level overview of our work on trying to reimagine all of societal mobility infrastructure as one coherent platform. I do have a tricky tendency to include too many slides, and I've repeated that pattern today, so please forgive me if I go a bit quickly at times and if I'm not able to go in depth on any of the topics. Really, today I want to focus more on how many of the pieces might fit together, so more of a high level. Now, I think many in the audience probably know as well or even better than me how the technological landscape's been shifting so very rapidly. As with other domains, so this is happening across all domains, but with mobility as well, we're being impacted by autonomy, social connectivity, a broad range of cyber technologies, applied AI, blockchain, and for us in particular, this impacts infrastructure digitization. But something I always try to stress is that the technological change is merely the start of the transformation, that the change induces a behavioral and conceptual change that we need to quantify and that needs to be integrated into our planning and management processes. And our own research tries to address that coming up with models and mathematical understandings of the interaction of technology and behavior, specifically with regard to mobility network planning and optimization. Now, some of the things I'll go through today will be at that high level and may appear quite theoretical, but I always try to stress that it's also very, very applied. I've been very grateful over the last 20 years. We've had well over 40 different industry and governmental sponsors. I put just a few of the highlights over to the right. We've done a lot of work around autonomous vehicle technology. Again, not building the car, but understanding how it impacts planning for the system and how the system will change. I think some of the earliest work in that area going back 15 years. Also transportation, electricity convergence, and so on. So I always just like to draw some attention to those. So for today, really maybe a starting point is thinking about mobility as a service. And this is now a very healthy, active area of research and application. It's really revolutionizing the way parts of society move. But our primary assertion today is that mobility as a service, even as big as it is less than half of the overall picture. The other half or more is the platform that the service will run on. And this follows a broader business trend. This isn't unique to our area at all. Platforms are very well known in the business realm. Uber is one very domain relevant for us. But the big ones, eBay, which is quite old now, Amazon, iTunes, or the App Store, all of these are platforms in some way providing a service. And for mobility, the thing to keep in mind in particular, the infrastructure becomes that platform. And so it's important to realize, especially for this particular domain, it's not just digital platforms, it's a combined, complete cyber physical integrated system. And that causes some peculiar particulars with regard to our area. And the glue that links these is that AI, blockchain, cyber technology. We gave just in the last few weeks an overview article at a very, again, high level in the conversation, and I put the link over there to the right, outlining some of these principles. At the highest of abstract levels, the three conceptual pillars in our research that we've identified, and again, you could think of these across domains, but I'll talk of how they manifest for mobility. The first pillar being integrated payment, and this is, again, a universal concept. We're not saying this is unique by any means, quite the opposite. We're saying it's a universal concept, and therefore we need to understand the transformative impact that it will have. So integrated payment, within transport mobility, has a long history as well. Oyster Card, Opal Card, this has been well understood, but it has a platform essence as well. Because if you think across all of those platforms, the App Store, Uber, and so on, the individual services, apps or drivers or whatever, do not have their own payment system. The platform manages the finances, and that's important. And that unlocks a lot of value. The second one being open data and standards. Again, if a platform's well designed and you have open standards, well, if you want to provide a service and you follow those standards and you apply to join it, well, you can join the platform as a service provider. And it's straightforward, and there's a lot of value to that. Now, there's a lot of regulation and safety considerations, but we'll come back to those a bit. But also, as part of joining the platform, you get access to the data. So the data is provided by the platform, not the individual service. Now, one thing that's often raised appropriately so, the ethics, and there's equity and ethics considerations around that data and privacy, and absolutely. But again, that goes into proper platform design, and that's the point where you should be thinking through those things. And so the open data and standards, the second critical pillar of designing that proper platform. And then the third one, which I would argue is often overlooked, but I've come to view as the most critical of the three, is reputation management. That really what's energized the platforms has been reputation. And that creates the real value of why it exists. I've argued, half jokingly, half not, Uber's really about monetizing reputation. The reason we're comfortable with a stranger picking us up and driving us somewhere is because Uber has figured out how to systemize reputation, both of the driver and the customer. Amazon, for that matter, too. If you can find a better deal and order from some seller you've never heard of that's better than the brand name, well, the reason you might be comfortable doing so is because of the feedback system and the systemized reputation. A colleague I was speaking to recently made the very good analogy to dodgy cabs in London. If at a point in time you were at a club, because you were much younger back then, way back then, and you left the club late at night and people were queued up and there weren't enough, proper cabs, there was always someone around saying, do you need a ride? And it would probably be for about half price and you could get it right away, but you might not do so because it's dangerous and unwise. Then maybe you were a bit impaired at the time. But if there was a system to systemized reputation, and you can see absolutely verifiably this person's given 300 rides over the last year and every single person said they were fine, well, then maybe you might be comfortable doing so. So systemized reputation is what unlocks the value of peer-to-peer interaction in a decentralized market. And so that, one way or another, should be part of a proper platform design. And so these three elements, when coming together, transforms how the system works. And that's one of the key assertions. Even on their own, they change the behavior. Together, they transform it dramatically. But to really envision and properly think through and design and consider this, that's at the high level. At the lower level, a lot of serious work has to get accomplished to understand how this will behave. And that's where it becomes delivering on these various streams of research. And again, for time, it's already ticking quickly. I won't go through in these at depth at all. I want to just say one or two quick things on each of these points, on economic aspects and the rest. On economic, this is where really a lot of the pioneering initial work, for instance, of mobility as a service happened. And we have absolute giants in the field that have done pioneering stuff. I'll talk just about our particular contributions in this area. And so we've done a range of things as well. This, I just wanted to highlight the current work of a PhD student of ours, Hao Ning, and she's looking at regulation, deregulation of the government for mass providers and mathematically deriving stakeholder interaction through driving utility functions and some game theoretic formulations to understand how they will interact differently based on different levels of regulation, particularly disentangling cross-network effects, profit, and social welfare. And these are important aspects to say, okay, should we even do it at all? Is it valuable to society to do these sort of things in particular ways? And that's a very critical starting point. Another one that I've always been very fond of is the network behavior that usually we separate out from the economic aspects because the models and the thinking often follow different streams. And this has been a personal core area of mine about 20 years or 25 now. And one way I characterize it is how this shifts in terms of information and data and connectivity. In something actually now quite a few years ago, we were very engaged with a Google outreach grant. where we got a year's worth of massive amount of Google data, and we're able to sit down with them a couple of times and talk through it, and did some good research out of that. And that started several year activity of looking more broadly at social media. And a good overview paper was led by a colleague of mine with myself and others in 2017, sort of summarizing some of that exploration. And a few specific applications grew out of that. One on instantaneous regional planning that I won't be able to get into today at all, but also continuing our work on adaptive equilibrium, which is how networks of travelers will interact with this constant real-time re-equilibration and information consumption. And that work started even in a way much earlier, all the way back 2002, when we did some adaptive shortest path work, which is how an individual person will adapt their route in real time with real-time information in a self-optimizing manner. And that's still to this day some of my favorite work, but it doesn't solve the problem because it's an individual person self-optimizing, but their actions don't change the conditions. What happens when you have lots of people doing this and changing each other's conditions and having to re-equilibrate? Well, that we formulated a particular variation of that in 2009 with a former PhD student of mine, Avi Krishnan, and we came up with a formulation and for some variance and understanding how that worked. And one of the things we put in that is a conclusion that information is not always good. I'm not saying information is always bad, for sure. And I would even say on average it's good, but there are situations where information actually makes everyone worse off, even if the information is correct. And to me, that's always been obvious. I have some colleagues that find that result counterintuitive. But for me, it's obvious because we are inherently self-optimizing. And so if you give me information, I become better at self-optimizing. And tragedy of the commons, that might not be good. But nonetheless, there's some debate about that. And so we've been looking at that for years and years as well. We published something in 2017 and PLOS, where we did an experimental economics run, where we had some participants actually play this game and look through the results. And we see that even humans playing the game, getting information, you will see an equilibration over repeated experiments. And we confirmed what the theoretical results showed, at least in terms of the experiment anyway, where the no information case, so you had a system cost of 210, and because it was an equilibrium, everyone had about the same system cost. And with information, it was 219. And everyone ended up worse off. And what does that mean? And that's my favorite finding so far to this day. The power of information is that it makes us more efficient at being selfish, which is to me, again, a bit obvious. And the reason I like to always include it is because it sort of justifies why do we do any of this research? And it's because things that may seem obvious at first, you make people more efficient, the world should be better. Well, no, not necessarily. All of game theory and tragedy of the commons teaches us maybe not. If the system objective does not align to self-optimizing objectives, then you might actually make things worse. Now, I'm not saying to not give information, or I'm not saying to lie to people for sure. That undermines trust and would destroy the world differently. But it will bring in concepts of equity and pricing and other elements that have to be incorporated when you're thinking of this platform. And so really, I'm sort of outlining this to say, there are very complex, wicked problems embedded in all of this, and we need to be thinking through them now and quickly, and especially before we start implementing things. One of the worst phrases I've ever heard is move fast, break stuff. That's horrible. That will destroy the world. We need to think carefully and be strategic, and this is just one of those highlights. So in asset management, this one I'll say even less at the moment, just because now time is super fleeting. This is ongoing work, collaborating with some colleagues in America for some NSF proposals and otherwise, and it really spans economic, infrastructure, civil considerations, equity and ethics. As I said, sort of this opens up disadvantaged groups, ethical concerns about privacy. This is a current ARC discovery grant. It's literally just starting this month, but it goes back a lot further, back to 2007 or a bit before. We did some work with the largest planning organization in America because they had to respond to an executive order on environmental justice, and they needed an engineering, mathematical-based way of ranking projects in terms of how they impacted disadvantaged groups. And we worked with them to actually come up with a method because they didn't have one. Systemized reputation, I won't be able to get into this much at all. We're approaching this from a game theoretic and other aspects, and collaborating with a former PhD student who's now a faculty member at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology with a very initial survey and then some experimental economic tests to go from there with some basic utility functions. The main initial finding was that people will pay a premium of 10% for an additional rating, and we're trying to disentangle how service will impact how they systemize that reputation. The most critical thing, trying to understand deeply how reputation influences decisions, how people will influence reputation, and then how that reputation is systemized and stored within technology like blockchain. The last thing is on that sort of blockchain smart contracts, and this is the last topic. And this is very current work with myself and a colleague and a research associate we're supervising. And this is really, it's trying to think of beginning by quantizing mobility as a resource and allowing people to contract for that resource and then trade it. And so we designed some smart contracts and tokens that allow people to request and receive mobility as a resource, and then to have a request for them to exchange it between each other, and then to create a market, a decentralized mobility exchange, to be able to try to self-optimize, again, back to the self-optimization, to exchange it to improve their condition in some way. And we've implemented that on the test net, not the main net, obviously, because it would be very high because we've done a lot of simulations. And the idea right now, exploring boundaries of how that will impact performance at the individual and the system level. So we've deployed the smart contracts. We've been running the experiments, 10,000 simulation runs so far. And we're seeing, there's sort of the results there. The system level, again, from a random start. So we're not saying that this is a typical start. That's the next step. So the initial one is just trying to explore some bounds on the performance and the communication costs. So right now what we're exploring is what's the expected communication costs of empowering this decentralized exchange, and then what sort of performance bounds might be achievable. The next steps from here are incorporating more of the adaptive equilibrium concepts, so that we start with realistic initial conditions and then attempt to optimize further from there and understand that performance. And the last thing that I'll say is, so across all of these streams, by fitting these pieces together, our goal is to understand how this platform could function under different scenarios, from centralized to decentralized, under different regulatory frameworks, and then helping to inform how it should be designed to prevent bad, draconian outcomes. My greatest fear is if we just let it happen, there could be a wholly decentralized, unregulated exchange that could be quite bad for society. And the only way to respond, because it can be pseudo-anonymous, would be facial recognition, cameras, and so on. But if we start now and try to be proactive in designing it properly, that's the best way to prevent a black market. But we have to be doing this right now. And that is the end.
Well done, Travis, to time and really interesting. The line about Uber's focus on reputation from the start of the talk just struck me. Is there a lesson for the SMEs in that aspect of reputation management? Or is there a scale aspect where just the bigger you are in these hyperscales, the more you need to focus on that, and it's less of an issue for the SMEs, or is it still an issue?
Oh, no, I think it's an issue. I would argue into the future, the name of the game will be reputation, however that is systemized. And I have some colleagues that say, well, that's the same as the traditional marketing brand research and concept, which I do disagree with. I think in terms of systemized reputation, it's more of an analytical metric-driven reality, because there is this massive data element, so there's more substance and function to it, whereas a lot of branding is a lot more about perception, which is still important, but distinct. And I think that opens it up more at the SME level, because you can focus on the metrics that are important for your market and your services.
But then the devil's still getting that data and being able to action it. But yeah, that's a point well made. Thank you so much for your presentation to us today. I'll see if there are any other questions that we'll share inside on the chat for you to answer, but we'll move on